الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أرسله بشيرا ونذيرا بين يدي الساعة من يطع الله ورسوله فقد رشد واهتدى ومن يعصهما فإنه قد غوى وإنه لا يضر إلا نفسه ولا يضر الله شيئا إن خير الحديث كتاب الله وخير الهدي هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وإن خير الأمور عوازمها وشر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قال الله تعالى في كتابه المجيد يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون أما بعد. Inshallah, in today's khutbah I want us to reflect back on the beginning of the da'wah of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, to the beginning of his prophethood, to the beginning when Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam in Mecca was a man calling for complete change in his society, a man calling for everyone to completely flip around their daily way of life, a man calling for the foundation of the society to become strictly La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, to become the foundation of everything, whether it be business, whether it's family life, whether it's ibadah, whether it's politics, whether it's relationships, that La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah should be the basis and foundation of everything in our lives. Now when we go back and think back to this time, when Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam first started, we see that what he called for didn't leave him safe. It didn't leave him, comfortably living anymore. We see that many people did not like what he called for. We see that, as is the case with most prophets, his own people from the city he grew up in were trying to drive him out. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam's own people attempted to assassinate him. And in this same time period, it's imperative for us to recognize the role that the Sahaba around him played during this time. They were constantly around him. The role of those who supported him, those who supported his da'wah regardless of what kind of situations it put them in, regardless of what backlash they would face. Whoever accepted Islam, they didn't give it up, and even if it meant being publicly abused, like Bilal radiallahu anhu, like Abdullah bin Mas'ud radiallahu anhu, and many others. Even if it meant being martyred, like Sumayya radiallahu anha. These are the situations that the Sahaba found themselves in by supporting Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam during the initial period of his da'wah in Mecca. But Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he had people around him who were strong-willed and determined. He had people around him who were brave and firm. He had people who had unwavering commitment to the da'wah of Islam. These were the Sahaba of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. These were the qualities they had. These are our role models. These are the people who many of us here were named after. Even me standing up here, my name is Musab. I was named after a Sahabi. Many of us in here have names like Ali, like Hamza, like Khalid. Many of us here were named after these Sahaba. And these Sahaba were men and women. They were Arab and they were not Arab. They were from various clans in the society. Some were old and some were very young. So we can relate to many of them, especially when we talk about that many of these Sahaba were young. Many of the early Sahaba that I'm referring to here, they were our ages, and many were even much younger. I'm saying our ages for the brothers here who are students at university, in your 20s, early 30s, teenagers. These were many of the early Sahaba. Many were much younger than us even. A number of the early Sahaba as young as about 30 years old. The likes of Abu Hudayfa bin Utbah, Bilal bin Rabah, Ayyash bin Rabi'a, and Amr bin Rabi'a. May Allah be pleased with them all. Many were even younger than that. They were in their 20s. Uqba bin Ghazwan, Abu Ubaidah bin al-Jarrah, Umar bin al-Khattab was 26, Abdullah bin Jahsh 25, Al-Miqdad bin Aswad, 24, Musab bin Umair, 24. And like I mentioned, many were the same ages as us. Many were much younger. Suhaib al-Rumi, Zayd ibn al-Haritha, Uthman ibn Affan, Tulayb ibn Umair, Khabbab bin Arat, they were all about 20 years old. All about 20 years old. These are the Sahaba that we're always talking about, that we see in many stories and many battles. We're talking about these ones I just listed, about 20 years old. As mentioned, many were even younger. Many were teenagers. The likes of Ja'far bin Abi Talib, Sa'ad bin Abi Waqqas, Sa'id bin Zayd, Abdullah bin Mas'ud, and even younger than them, we know the stories of Ali bin Abi Talib radiyallahu anhu, Zubayr bin al-Awwam, Talha bin Ubaydullah, and Al-Arqam ibn Abi al-Arqam. May Allah be pleased with all of them. Now, why am I listing all these names to you guys? I just listed probably 20 names of different Sahaba. The point here is not that I bore you with the list of names. The point here is not that we memorize this list of names and just memorize their ages so we can say, look how young the Sahaba were. The reason I read all these names right now, and purposely read many of them, is so we can understand and recognize the sheer amount of the Sahaba at the time from the very beginning who were that young. Understand how many of them were of that age. And I didn't even read all of them right now. There were many more from those ages and younger who I have not listed. I only listed from the Sahaba who were men right now. There were also many young women who accepted Islam as well at young ages. So you can see that it was much more than this also. And we know that compared to the whole of Mecca, the Muslims were not many. So from that small group that Rasulullah ﷺ had, this many of them were the youth. This many of them were teenagers, were in their early 20s, were in their 20s. These were the Sahaba at the time. So let's really think on the last few who I just mentioned, like Ali bin Abi Talib radiyallahu anhu. The last few being the youngest of them, who were 8 years old, 10 years old, 12 years old. Ali bin Abi Talib radiyallahu anhu, there's different narrations about his age. Some say he was 8 years old when he accepted Islam. A Sahabi who went on to become the 4th rightly guided Khalifa. A Sahabi who was one of the 10 promised Jannah. 2 of the other young ones I mentioned were also promised Jannah. Zubayr bin al-Awwam and Talha bin Ubaydullah. These were the young Sahaba around Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And the last of the youngest that I mentioned was Al-Arqam ibn Abi al-Arqam. Only about 12 years of age when he accepted Islam, but he still played one of the most critical roles in the history of Islam. Al-Arqam ibn Abi al-Arqam, at 12 years old, he supported the da'wah in a way that allowed Islam to spread and build up all the Sahaba to become stronger. And to understand that, we can understand the context first, that after Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam received the first revelation of ayat from Angel Jibreel alayhi salam, and after the first few Muslims accepted Islam, these Muslims began spreading the deen to those who were close to them, those who were generally in their company. This was after Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Ya ayyuhal muddathir qum fa'andhir. O you who is covered, stand up and warn. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is commanding him to warn others. So Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he started contacting these other people that the Sahaba used to talk to. The early Sahaba, they would reach out to whoever they knew, and they would set up meetings with Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Often he would go to their houses and he would meet with them there and discuss with them, or they would figure out some other way to meet. And this was working, and Islam was spreading, and he would sometimes even send other Sahaba who knew more to teach others. And brothers, could you please move up? There's some standing in the back. Please move up as much as possible. So Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam would set up the meetings to teach these individuals who are interested in Islam and wanted to learn more. The existence of Islam was already known in Mecca, but people being taught about it, this was happening in private and generally. And as it was increasing and there were more and more people interested, there had to be some more ways set up for people to learn. And that's where Al-Arqam ibn Abi al-Arqam came in. At just 12 years old, he opened up his home to essentially be the center, the starting point of Islam. He opened up his home that any time anybody wanted to learn from Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, they would meet him there. That was the place where the Sahaba would go for Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam to teach them more about Islam, to teach them more about what's being revealed. So this was the place for the first few years before they began proclaiming more widely in public. This was the place where the Muslims learned their deen, where the Muslims developed their understanding of Islam as a way of life from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself. This was in the house of Al-Arqam. And this was until the ayah was revealed that mentioned them proclaim openly that which you are commanded and turn away from the mushrikun. So at that point, then the Muslims began to proclaim Islam more openly outside in the society. But we see how Al-Arqam, just 12 years old, played such a major role in the early days of Islam. Him opening the doors to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam allowed and facilitated Islam's growth. It facilitated that understanding of the deen amongst Sahaba. It facilitated their understanding of the obligations that they had to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for themselves and for the society. Now these young Sahaba, Al-Arqam and others, as we can see now from some of the examples, they were the ones tasked with standing up to the Quraysh. Islam was now more openly proclaimed. They were the ones tasked with standing up to the Quraysh. They were the young Sahaba who were the same ones who fought in the battles like Badr and Uhud and others that came after. And we see that these young Sahaba, they were the ones who took care of the society around them. They are the ones who cared for one another and wanted to make sure that their society was taken care of for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They worked to fulfill their obligations of ensuring that as many people as possible felt the mercy of Islam and felt the justice of Islam in their daily lives. This is what the Sahaba would work towards, for everybody to feel that justice and mercy of Islam in their lives. So when we see these examples of many youth around the Sahaba, I'm bringing this up, of course, because many of the brothers and sisters here at the university were very young, alhamdulillah, in our 20s and 30s. They're still very young ages. So the message from this, the first and foremost, is to never underestimate your capabilities because of your youth. Never underestimate your own capabilities because of your youth. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned in a famous hadith to take advantage of 5 before 5. And the first one he mentions is take advantage of your youth before your old age. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam commands us to ensure we take advantage of this time. And we see that as this is one of the things we need to take advantage of, we should never let ourselves believe or let someone else make us believe that our youth is what should prevent us from playing a critical role in changing this world. From playing a critical role like Al-Arqam did, radiyallahu anhu. Playing a critical role like Ali ibn Abi Talib, radiyallahu anhu, who stood for Islam as a youth and went on to become the fourth rightly guided Khalifa of Islam. So we see from all these past examples that the young Muslim men and the young Muslim women, they carried that burden of illustrating the light of Islam to the rest of the world. They're the ones who carried that burden, as well as the many other Sahaba as well, but the youth were the ones who pushed that message the most. And yes, we need the knowledge to do so as well. That is something we need to consider. We need the knowledge to be able to do so. But also we should not be letting the pursuit of knowledge before taking action. We should not allow the pursuit of knowledge to allow us to fall short on other obligations. Once we are aware and convinced and have the knowledge on a certain action as our obligation, now we have an accountability in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to ensure that obligation is fulfilled. So as youth, as young Muslim men and women, we don't push aside our obligations to replace it with, we need to have more knowledge first before we take care of our obligation. No, as soon as we understand something as our obligation, we must act on that. And we must do our best to fulfill it, while we of course continue to seek knowledge, and continue to seek knowledge on the same and other points as well. Ali ibn Abi Talib, radiyallahu anhu, he reported that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, the pen is lifted from 3 people. A sleeping person until he awakens, a child until he becomes an adult, and an insane person until he regains his sanity. So this hadith shows us very clearly that once we reach a certain age, once you reach that age of puberty, of maturity, that is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is holding us accountable for our deeds at that point. The pen is no longer lifted. Meaning now, once we reach that age, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes into account every sin that is committed, including any obligation that is not fulfilled. Which is of course, in many ways, the opposite of what we see in the society around us today. We see that many of the people in their general age group, young Muslim men and women, of course, additionally, unfortunately, but young men and women in general in this society, we see that that's not the direction they're pushed in. It's almost the opposite, that instead this is a time when, we just have fun, that accountability is not really the focus. However, as Muslims, we see we have a different mindset, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is now at this age holding us accountable for our actions. Now, how do we carry this to the rest of the world today? Because the examples like we gave of the Sahaba right now, of these many young men and women at the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they played roles in completely changing a society. They played roles in something major. And we see that the Muslim world, we have many major things going on today. So what role do we play in that now? That should be our next question. We see we have many situations around the world, leaving us wondering, how do we fulfill our obligations to the rest of the ummah? We see situations in Morocco, for example, with the earthquake. We see situations with the floods in Libya. And it pains us to see it. As Muslims, it pains us to hear about these things, to see the images, to see the videos. It pains us every single time. And it pains us to see the state of the Muslim world across the world. In many other countries as well, we know there's many situations that have been going on for decades now. And we as Muslims, of course, we have to do something about this. We have responsibilities towards our Muslim brothers and sisters around the world. And we know some of the things that we should do. We know some of the things we can do. Of course, we can donate money. We can donate money to these causes. We can donate money to help those in need. And of course, we receive immense award from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for doing this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward, and He encourages us to donate. In addition to that, we can make dua. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of course, would like us to make dua. We should be making dua. Anytime we have any kind of hardship, we should be making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us. But we must also remember that dua in these situations and in all situations, dua is coupled with action. So when we make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we ourselves must exert the efforts to ensure that we are doing what we can to achieve what we're making dua for. So it's on us as well. We make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but we must exert our own efforts. We must think larger than just making dua. That is where it starts, and we continue after that as well. And to connect this back to the stories of the Sahaba as young Muslim men and women around Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we see that they had the time and they had the energy for it, as the ones who were younger than the others. And we have that as well. Of course, compared to the rest of the Muslim Ummah, of course, the younger Muslim men and women, we have more time and energy to ensure that we are doing what we can for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we see from our past examples that this is exactly what those young Sahaba took advantage of to assist Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to support Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He taught them through this, through their support and through their time with him, He taught them the true and righteous leadership to deal with all of our societal issues. All of our issues going all the way to what we deal with today, from the earthquakes and floods in Morocco and Libya. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam taught the Sahaba how to deal with these things. Think of the life of Umar ibn al-Khattab radiyallahu anhu. During his time as the Khalifa, during his period of time when he was the Khalifa, there was a drought, there was a famine that went down during this time. And Umar ibn al-Khattab radiyallahu anhu, Amir al-Mu'mineen, the leader of the believers, when the other Muslims were not eating, he would not eat. Not just the Muslims, anybody who he was responsible for. He wanted to make sure everybody ate before him. This was his priority. Make sure everybody is taken care of. This was to the point that some of the Sahaba around Umar ibn al-Khattab radiyallahu anhu, they were worried about his health because of how much he was not eating. Some of them were scared he was going to pass away during this time. That he wanted to make sure that everybody around him were the one who ate first. And he's a leader of a state at this point. He's the head of a state. He is the leader of all the Muslims. He's in charge of many non-Muslims. And he's saying, no, I am not going to eat until I make sure everybody else has eaten. This was the mentality of Umar ibn al-Khattab radiyallahu anhu. This is what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam taught them as righteous leadership. This is the true leadership that Muslims are supposed to have. Not the leadership we see in the Muslim world today, where leaders in the Muslim world and non-Muslim world, unfortunately, they eat, and they're comfortable while people suffer. This is not what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam taught us. Not the leadership of the Muslim world today, where the countries care for their own countries within their borders, rather than the Muslim brothers and sisters abroad who are suffering as well. And not exerting any kind of efforts to take care of the Muslims suffering in other parts of the world, whether it be Morocco, Libya, or otherwise. When Muslims have any level of authority, any level of leadership, we are responsible for everybody underneath. We're responsible for everyone. And it goes all the way back to accountability in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the most important thing. The Muslims who are leaders are accountable for taking care of everybody they are responsible for. This is what it always comes down to. Every single one of us will be accountable on the Day of Judgment in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for his or her deeds. And we have similar examples of this leadership from the life of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself. Think of the Battle of Ahzab. During this time, one of the Sahaba went up to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he showed him he had a stone tied around his stomach. He had a stone on his stomach and it was tied around him, pressing against his stomach to alleviate the pain from the hunger he was feeling at the time. Now what did Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam do? What did the perfect example of leadership do for us? Did he treat himself while the Muslims were suffering, while the Muslims had stones tied around their stomachs? The Sahabi came up to him with a stone tied around his stomach. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he lifted up his clothing. He had 2 stones tied around his stomach. SubhanAllah. This was the leadership of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We see that from Umar ibn al-Khattab radiyallahu anhu. We see that from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this was the true leadership. He taught us what leadership is meant to be. He taught us how we are supposed to interact with the world around us, how we are supposed to be responsible for the Muslims around us. And we as the young Muslim men and women of this ummah, we see from the life of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that we have that responsibility on our shoulders to carry this light of Islam to the rest of the world, to make sure they all feel the justice and mercy of Islam. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to be among those who follow in his footsteps. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us among those who bring Islam back to the world. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us among those who learn and implement the leadership qualities of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala aid our brothers and sisters suffering in Morocco and Libya and across the world. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept those who lost their lives in Morocco and Libya to be accepted as shuhada. أقول قولي هذا أستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الأمين أما بعد فيا معشر المسلمين أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قال الله تعالى في كتابه الكريم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على سيدنا ومولانا محمد بعدد من صلى وصام اللهم صل على سيدنا ومولانا محمد بعدد من قعد وقام اللهم صل على جميع الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى سائر الصحابة والتابعين وعلى عبادك الصالحين اللهم أيد الإسلام والمسلمين اللهم انصر من نصر دين محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم واجعلنا منهم واخذل من خذل دين محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم ولا تجعلنا منهم اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه اللهم ثبتنا على الإسلام اللهم ثبتنا على الإسلام اللهم نور قلوبنا بنور الإيمان اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات الأحياء منهم والأموات عباد الله رحمكم الله إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون اذكروا الله يذكركم وادعوه يستجب لكم ولذكر الله تعالى أعلى وأولى وأعز وأجل وأتم وأهم وأكبر وأقيموا الصلاة